And so with that, I'd like to introduce Jim Himes, our congressman.
Yeah. Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Thank you, Darien Men's Association. Good morning, gentlemen and ladies, too. It's a delight to be back with you this morning. And my plan, as usual, will be to just give you some remarks, I'm going to try to give you some impressions on politics. And this is not a political rally. I'm not here to sort of advise the Democrats in the room on how the Democrats can, recapture whatever limited momentum we've had in the number of years. I spend an awful lot of time thinking about how our current politics affects the republic and what the implications are in this very weird time. And so I just want to share with you a couple of reflections on where we are. And I'm going to sound a slightly more optimistic note than you might expect from me. My party having taken a pretty severe drubbing in the November elections, but that of course has caused a lot of introspection. And I'm very fortunate. You all know this district very well. It is by and large a moderate district. It has for many generations was a Republican district. The onset of a more populist Southern evangelical strain of Republicanism began to migrate it more towards the center. And then, of course, the emergence of MAGA took towns like New Canaan and Darien and Greenwich, which were traditionally very Republican, and turned them into towns that Democrats fairly regularly win. And that's something that's reflected, of course, around the country. The biggest predictor today of voting behavior is actually not class, as it sort of used to be. It's level of education. And this is a pretty educated place. And as a consequence, you've seen a migration in the direction of the Democratic Party, even as you have seen those towns in Connecticut. And yes, there are some, Shelton, Derby, Ansonia, these post-industrial towns that are populated less by college graduates and more by people who are sort of children of the families that worked in the mills that those towns hosted until 50 years ago, become more red. But anyway, so I want to touch briefly on domestic affairs, and I'm going to sound maybe a slightly more optimistic note than you might expect from me. And I do want to spend a few minutes on the international arena, because it's a pretty dangerous and volatile world out there right now. And I spend an awful lot of my time in Washington. Honestly, my sort of day by day, hourly by hourly job in Washington is my role as the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. That involves the oversight of the 17 agencies of the intelligence community, the most prominent of which are the CIA and the NSA. And these are organizations that are doing very dangerous things, in some cases taking lethal action, certainly doing a great deal of surveillance. And so that oversight job, because the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times don't get to crawl all over those activities for obvious reasons, that oversight job is both a spectacular job, but pretty important. And that's important to me at a time when, politics are as dysfunctional as they are today. Okay, so let me start with the domestic scene. And the question that I get from Democrats throughout my congressional district, which is, does the Republic survive? Are we headed in the direction of Hungary, of Orban's Hungary, the more explosive and concerned Democrats? Are we headed the direction of Germany in the 1930s? What is the outcome of the rejection of traditional establishment, by the way, including the traditional Republican Party, the rejection of the many, many norms, the attacks on scientific research at places like Harvard? Where does this all lead? And I would observe that there are lots of populations out there that are right to be extremely concerned. If you're an undocumented alien right now, your life is a very frightening one. And we can have a long conversation about that if you want. One of the reasons the Democrats lost the election was the visual of insecure borders. And it shouldn't be hard for Democrats to say a country needs secure borders. It is also true, of course, that in Fairfield County, if you could snap your fingers and get rid of every undocumented immigrant in the country, every illegal, whatever you want to call them, if you could do that, our economy would grind to a halt in a matter of minutes, right? Because every restaurant, every contractor, every lawn mowing business, relies on this workforce. And so, it's in my opinion, an issue that should be dealt with a little more grace, perhaps, than it is dealt with. But anyway, the reason I'm making this point is that there are obviously populations that feel very, very targeted right now. And it's not just the undocumented, it's actually people with green cards, right? Because this administration has attempted to deport people with green cards, many instances for articulating political opinions with which they were not comfortable. This is something that should concern all of us. If our country stands for one thing, it stands for the notion that the government doesn't get to tell you what to think or believe or write or say. And the attempted deportations of people who happen to be pro-Gaza or whatever is a little odd for a country that has always valued freedom of expression and incorporated that, of course, into the First Amendment of our Constitution. The attacks on trans members of the military. Again, if you're in that community, I could imagine you being very, very upset. But I would point out that on the economy, where I think some very serious mistakes are being made, I'll sound like an old school Republican. The Republican Party of the Wall Street Journal days, of course, was powerfully opposed to tariffs and powerfully in favor of immigration, which is why I say that MAGA sort of rejects the traditional Republican establishment. But the tariff thing, which, Donald Trump is a very transactional president. He doesn't have a lot of fixed beliefs, but he does in the realm of tariffs. Now, I don't think the president understands tariffs. He sees them as a tax that is paid by China for the right to export goods to the United States, which of course is not what a tariff is. But that for him is catechism. And again, he doesn't have a lot of fixed beliefs, but tariffs are one of them, migration, of course, being the other. But you see with the reaction to Liberation Day and the remarkable market dislocation that ensued, what was it, 8% drop in the equity markets, a profound softening in the bond markets, including the treasury markets, and a pretty substantial decline in the dollar. That gave Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, the standing. I can only imagine what this meeting is like, but to walk into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, we're about to catalyze a major economic problem. And so I think of the tariff issue as sort of a bit self-correcting, because the president is, if he's one thing, he's responsive to feedback, and the market feedback that ensued from the tariffs was pretty dramatic. Now, it's still going to be bad. I think in the next couple of months, we're going to see the inflationary effects of 10% across the board tariffs, in many instances higher than that. There's just no way you can impose those tariffs without having automobiles be more expensive at the end of the day once the inventories have been exhausted. And so, it will be a little bit of a self-correcting problem, because I do think that in the next 2 months, people are going to walk into Ford dealerships and be told by those Ford dealers why the Ford Bronco is now $2,000 more expensive than it was 3 months ago. And that is going to have the same sort of political effect that expensive chicken did last summer, and of course redounded to the pain of the Biden administration. I'm profoundly troubled by the sort of hacking away at research, because this country's abiding competitive advantage is our innovative capacity. I mean, if you name the top 100 technology firms on the planet, 92 or 93 of them are here in the United States. I mean, it's sort of hard to name a European technology giant. There are a few, but the same is true in Asia. And that stems from the fact that we have always committed to being a profoundly innovative economy. And underneath that, of course, is the basic research that the government used to primarily do, and they still do, through organizations, through groups like Harvard, through the MIT and Lincoln Labs and that sort of thing. And as a national security guy, my worry is not so much what North Korea does tomorrow, but what happens if we lose our innovative edge? What happens if the United States is not at the cutting edge of biosynthesis, where we can create almost anything we want to create, a virus, a bacteria, even a mammal? What happens if we're not at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence? What happens if the Chinese beat us to a general artificial intelligence? I could continue going on about my fear of what happens if we're no longer the leader on innovation. But, and here's the point I want to make. So far, if the question is what's the future of the republic, so far it is my opinion, and we have this really, I think, sort of stupid argument about whether the country's in a constitutional crisis. My own definition of a constitutional crisis is when we are deadlocked, when the government is no longer providing any sort of check or balance on a president who is asserting unprecedented authorities. The truth is that hasn't happened yet because of the judiciary. The courts have time and time again, in some 240 cases, except for a few instances relating to the existence of independent agencies like the CFPB, the courts have ruled against this administration. They've ruled against the president's right to tell Harvard University you cannot have international students. They've ruled against the idea that the 14th Amendment can be simply wished away. It's just been a persistent thing. And while the White House has raised a little bit of hell about that, and Stephen Miller is regularly trashing judges and saying, activist judges are undertaking judicial coups, the president has consistently repeated the refrain that he will abide by court decisions. He's repeatedly say, what I do is I appeal, I don't ignore. And that's really important because every president asserts authorities and powers that the courts turn him back on. President Biden notably wanted to do wholesale student loan forgiveness, and the Supreme Court said no, and the president wasn't happy, but he did what presidents have always done and said, I will abide by the decision of the courts. Obama was turned back on his desire to, through executive order, make the Dreamers, these are the young people who are here illegally, but they came as babies and so they don't know any country. Obama said, I want to legalize the status of the Dreamers, and the Supreme Court said no. So this is not a new thing. It's new in its magnitude, obviously. But so far, the president has, though maybe dragging his feet on complying with these decisions, he has abided by the decisions. And the courts continue to have more tools than you might imagine to enforce these decisions if they decide that the administration is being unreasonably dilatory in abiding by them. So, for example, we haven't seen this yet, but courts have the tool of both criminal and civil contempt. So let's just imagine that the administration decides to ignore a court order and continue to fly without due process the undocumented into this, god-awful prison in El Salvador. The courts could and would identify everybody in the chain of command from the president on down to the pilot who flies that flight and hold those individuals in either civil or criminal contempt. Now, criminal contempt is complicated because criminal contempt would require the Department of Justice to pursue a case against its own people, not likely to happen. But a civil contempt does not require that. And civil contempt allows a court to say to that pilot who's piloting the plane, we're going to garnish your wages. We're going to go after your assets. And that is a really scary thing for a lot of people who are engaged in, were it to happen, the act of ignoring a court order. Now, we haven't gotten there yet, thank goodness. And I don't think we will. This is my note of optimism. I think Stephen Miller notwithstanding, the president will do what every president has done up until now and not blatantly ignore a court order. I say every president. If you go back to 1834 to Andrew Jackson, famous case pertaining to the Cherokee Indians in Georgia, I guess it was, and John Marshall, Supreme Court Chief Justice, rules against the president, and this, of course, is the nightmare scenario, and President Jackson famously says, well, Mr. Marshall has rendered his decision, now let him enforce it, where Jackson is saying, the courts don't have guns, they don't have people to actually enforce their decisions. But anyway, I don't think we get to that point, which is really, really important. Meanwhile, and maybe this is a cheery note for the Democrats in the room, some semblance of normal politics is beginning to reassert itself. We are a long way from having the Congress act as a check or a balance on this president. But if you look at the polling around this president's number, the president's popularity has plummeted, largely, I think, as a result of the tariffs and what that did to the markets and people seeing that and people worried about inflation and the economic situation. As that happens, more and more of my Republican colleagues reach around and find their backbone and say, I will actually, for the first time in a couple of months, think about standing in opposition to the president, which at the end of the day is really what Congress is there to do. with respect to the president. So again, if I'm right and we start to see inflationary effects associated with these tariffs, I think you're going to see not just 2 or 3 Republican senators, not just 2 or 3 members of the House, but more Republicans saying, hey, we've got to put some hands on the wheel here because the midterms are not that far away, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that's the source of my optimism. While it is a very scary time from the standpoint of our norms, I do see the stirrings of politics returning to the Congress in a way that I think is likely to put a little bit more of a check and a balance on this president. Okay, so let me. I wanted to do two other things. Spend just 2 minutes on a interesting thing that's emerging in my own party that I'm really excited about. Some of you will have heard of the abundance movement. And then I'll spend 5 minutes or so on international affairs, which I also have a little bit of a note of optimism on. But so for the Democrats in the room, or for people who are sort of interested in politics, one of the reasons the Democrats got their clocks cleaned in the last election was that polling showed that the Democratic Party was incapable of delivering anything. The worst polling, yes, people thought we were too permissive on the woke stuff and not focused enough on the price of chicken. There's a whole bunch of polling, but the number one criticism of the Democratic Party was that they can't get anything done. And I don't blame people for feeling that way because the Biden presidency was, at least for its first 2 years, actually pretty productive. We passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a huge industrial policy to try to address climate change. We can have a whole conversation about industrial policy if you want. I'm skeptical of it, but anyway, it was what it was. And it passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was the biggest investment in our transportation infrastructure since the Eisenhower administration. And what did we actually deliver? Yeah, Dick Blumenthal and I went to lots of shovel things and celebrated and stuff, but what did we actually deliver? Nada, nothing. We didn't build a single electric charging station in the state of Connecticut after years of having passed the Inflation Reduction Act. And so Ezra Klein, if some of you will be aware of this book, and Derek Thompson have written a book called Abundance, in which they pose a really interesting challenge to the Democratic Party, which is, Democrats, you say that you're the party that can deliver good things via government to the American people, but you have so tied yourself up in regulatory knots and red tape and input from local communities and the desire that, buildings do 12 different social purposes that you can't deliver anything. And people aren't stupid. They see that. And so there's a really interesting movement bubbling up in which I am involved to say, if we're going to be the party that says that the government can deliver good stuff, we actually ought to do it. And let's start thinking about how we can accelerate projects that make people's lives better. One little example that pertains to this district, not so much to this community, but on the New York border in Greenwich, the Byram River floods regularly. And there's a little community there just north of the Post Road where 70 or 80 houses get flooded by the Byram River. And the Army Corps of Engineers comes in and determines that that's because the bridge that was built in the 1950s, it's actually 2 bridges it's the Post Road crossing into New York, the arches are too low. So what happens is a lot of water comes down the Byram River, the water backs up and it floods this neighborhood. Pretty easy fix. You build 2 bridges that have a lot more underpass for water to get through. We started working on this project 8 years ago. These are crappy little bridges. You can drive over them. They're crappy little cement. I mean, this is not the Walk Bridge in Norwalk, right? It takes all of the United States rail traffic on the way to Boston over. It's a crappy little concrete bridge. And they're going to start construction in 4 years. 4 years from now. Meanwhile, of course, these communities in Byram, every year, they worry about being flooded, loss of life, loss of property. And so we're getting dead serious about saying that's ridiculous. Anybody have a guess as to how long it took to build the Empire State Building in New York City? Anybody know? Just over a year. And it's going to take me 6 years to build a crappy little bridge over the Byram River on the New York border. That obviously is a huge political problem. Okay, last thing. And then I'm delighted to take your questions on any topic whatsoever. Internationally, my opinion is that the strategic mistakes of the United States since I was a child in the mid-1960s, the strategic mistakes of the United States have been mistakes of idealism. We really thought, the Kennedy administration and the Nixon administration really thought that if we just held the line in Vietnam, we could prevent Vietnam from going communist, in the language of the era. We completely missed that the Vietnam insurgency was as much about anti-colonial assertion of independence, sound familiar, as it was about the expansion of communism. And therefore, we wound up with 53,000 lost Americans in an unwise war. I think it's fair to say that the George W. Bush administration, apart from their jonesing to go after the leader who humiliated George W. Bush's father initially by remaining in power, there was this idea that if we just got Saddam Hussein out of the way, the Iraqi people would rise up like the citizens of Concord and Lexington and establish a democratic order. And of course, in Afghanistan, we spent over a decade and billions of dollars, hundreds of lives trying to remake a pre-medieval society in our own image. And so the president is not wrong when he identifies something that George Washington knew, which is that it is a dangerous thing when we go out, in the language of George Washington, to fight monsters abroad. It is often, and I do think it's really driven by idealism. We are, at the end of the day, a revolutionary power who believes that the world should live in some sort of democratic system, but we get it wrong persistently. And so this instinct that the president has, which is an instinct against war, and in particular against war in the Middle East, I think is actually a pretty healthy instinct. If you agree with me that the mistakes that we have made have largely been mistakes of overcommitting to kinetic conflict in complicated places. And while I am appalled by the language that the president uses, I was just in Europe 3 weeks ago, and I'm appalled by the language that the president uses. But the idea that, these immensely wealthy countries in Europe, Germany, UK, Spain, France, etc., should contribute more to their self-defense so that we've got more resources to build schools and highways and bridges is not a bad idea. In fact, I think it's a good idea. And so inasmuch as those are the two underlying through points of the president's thinking around foreign policy, I think those are good things. In fact, I got myself in all kinds of trouble 3 weeks ago with my own party because when the president went to the Middle East and stopped the pouring of billions of dollars of weapons onto the Houthis. Now, the Houthis are very bad people, and we should find some way to, take away their weapons. But we were emptying our arsenals to not much effect. We had 2 aircraft carriers in the Red Sea. I mean, this is a big deal, and we were not having much effect. When the president says we're going to stop that, when the president tells the prime minister of Israel, as he did, that no, you shouldn't attack Iran right now. Iran's a bad place. You can understand the emotional idea of going after a very bad regime, but an awful lot of oil comes through the Persian Gulf there, and a conflict in that region would have profound economic effects at minimum, not to mention what the Iranians would do if they were attacked. They would, get terrorism going throughout Europe, etc. When the president says, no, you're not going to, we're going to negotiate with the Iranians, I say that's not bad. That's not bad. Those are 2 things that I think have probably put us in the direction of better stability in a really complicated corner of the world. I do bemoan the president's abandonment, really, of this idea that we do stand up for democratic regimes. I mean, it's going to be a few generations before we live down that scene in the Oval Office where Vance was attacking President Zelensky and where we then subsequently voted in the United Nations with the Russians and the North Koreans on a resolution that identified Russia as the aggressor. I mean, again, it's going to take some time to live that down. But if you agree with me that a lot of the mistakes that we have made have been mistakes of over-engagement and a bias towards military engagement, I do think that this president has an instinct that will pull that back a little bit, and quite arguably, my politics are pretty clear on this president, but will end conceivably with a second Trump term, which, like the first Trump term, didn't have the United States engaged in warfare abroad. So let me stop there, and happy to take questions on any topic whatsoever.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm going to start here. We have some members on Zoom, and I know there is a question being posted from Mark Noonan. Let's see. Can we bring up Mark, who is joining us from Slovenia. Where are you, Mark? There he is. Lower
I'm
right.
here.
Hi, take it away.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Congressman. As you probably know, there are 5 to 10 million U.S. citizens living abroad, many of them here in Europe where you recently were. This is a population comparable to many U.S. states, and I urge your immediate attention to two critical issues affecting us. One is the citizenship-based taxation policy of the U.S. We are the only developed country to apply this. It means that you pay taxes based on citizenship no matter where you work or live. You also pay taxes in that country, so you're double taxed. This practice is obviously unfair and creates competitive disadvantages for U.S. workers and businesses. So I would ask you, would you please co-sponsor Congressman Darien LaHood's bill called Residence-Based Taxation for Americans Abroad Act, which converts our policy to residence-based taxation. This is a bipartisan issue. I don't think it's a very controversial idea, and I'd love some commentary from you on that. The second issue I have is the Know Your Customer banking discrimination. The U.S. has a Know Your Customer regulation designed to prevent financial crime, which is all well and good, but it is now causing arbitrary closure of long-established banking and brokerage accounts for law-abiding U.S. citizens living abroad. Despite decades of loyalty and clear financial histories with their banks or brokerages, many, including elderly individuals, are losing access to their accounts simply for not having a U.S. residential address. This destroys their credit histories, their FICO scores, and, most importantly, their trust in the U.S. government. As a member of the House Financial Services Committee, you are uniquely positioned to address this unjust practice. My question is simply, will you please act on these two issues? One, by contacting Representative LaHood regarding his bill. If you've already done so, thank you. I'd love an update. And two, working to revise the Know Your Customer criteria to protect law-abiding American citizens from unfair discrimination. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't love podiums, but I'll since you probably need that for other questions, right? Okay. Mark, thank you for the questions. The answer to your questions are yes. I'm very familiar with the issue of double taxation for expatriates. I happened to have been in London about a year ago, and a group organized a meeting on precisely this topic. I don't know Darien LaHood. I don't know his legislation, but I'm delighted to take a look at it. Darien's a good friend. We sit on the Intelligence Committee together, and he does good work. So yes, I will take a look at that. The KYC thing, the Know Your Customer stuff. Thank you for bringing it up. I wasn't conscious of that as an issue for expatriates. But yes, I will take a look at that. It's an interesting thing on both of those questions. I do spend a lot of time, so far unsuccessfully, thank you, Chuck Schumer, trying to get fair treatment for Connecticut residents vis-a-vis their taxation in New York. Some of you will be very familiar with this. New York is extremely aggressive in taxing your income in Connecticut. If you spend Monday in New York and 4 days in Connecticut, New York, in some instances will regard that as a week spent in New York. So I do spend a lot of time on that issue, crossing swords with Chuck Schumer and, of course, the leader of the House, Hakeem Jeffries. So I'm not going to promise you a success there in the immediate term. But yes, I will absolutely take a look at LaHood's legislation. Very familiar with the issue, and you're right, it is unfair.
And if you need examples about Know Your Customer, I've got lots of them. I know people here who get an email saying we're closing your accounts in 2 months, period. You know, they've been working with that bank or that brokerage for 30 or 40 years. They know the manager of the branch. They tell the financial people in the security department of the bank, call my manager. And they say it doesn't count. You don't have a residential address in the U.S. It's really devastating to older people. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that.
Congressman, thank you very much for coming and for your remarks. I saw you recently interviewed and you expressed some concerns about the Qatari plane, and it was not in the direction of, oh, the president shouldn't accept gifts of that nature. It was more from a security perspective about, is it safe to have a plane that was outfitted in Qatar fly our president around in emergency situations? And I'll assume that you also were equally troubled by the Signalgate stuff with the text messages from from personal phones winging around the defense and intelligence leadership of the country. And these are not really partisan questions, and I really want to know from you, as somebody who is in the minority in an environment where you're never forgetting that. What, if anything, can you do to be a little bit of a bad cop on people's tactics in the area of national security?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And you're right about the plane. My friend Jamie Raskin, who's a constitutional law professor, tells me this is an emolument, which is pretty clearly forbidden by the Constitution, explicitly forbidden by the Constitution. Now, it gets a little legally fiddly, non-lawyer here. It gets a little legally fiddly because they're giving it to the Department of Defense. Now, Jamie told me, lo and behold, that when the French gave us the Statue of Liberty, which was an example that the White House used, that Congress actually deliberated, as the Constitution requires, the acceptance of that gift. So anyway, I'll leave the legality of it to the lawyers. But yes, I'll tell you a story. So I'm in Islamabad probably 5 years ago, and that's a tough trip. You know, the Pakistanis are sometimes our friends and sometimes very much not our friends. So I go to their intelligence service, the ISI, famed for sometimes working with us and sometimes absolutely not working with us. And they give me a vase. This is a 2-foot tall ceramic vase, blue and white. It's very pretty. I get a kick out of the fact that the ISI gave me a vase. That vase spent 6 months in some security office being examined before I could put it in my office. A 747 is a lot more complicated than a vase. So from a security standpoint, it is a terrible idea. And in fact, what we'll need to do, if in fact this goes through, is every rivet, nut, and screw on that plane will need to be disassembled. Every bit of software, and a 747 has a lot of software on it, will need to be wiped. And I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to spend more time and money if they're going to move the president around on this thing than they do if they just got Boeing to do what they're supposed to do and build one. And by the way, the stakes are extremely high, right? You will remember from 9/11, the President of the United States spent hours on Air Force One because no one was sure if it was secure for him to be in the other. So Air Force One is one of the places the president goes in an existential crisis. So this is not screwing around stuff. And anyway, enough said there. I was probably surprised a few people in the room by being optimistic on where we are. The Signalgate thing illustrates what happens when you put responsible people in a clown-like environment. And that troubles me across the spectrum. When the president seizes Memorial Day to say Happy Memorial Day to everybody except for the scum who for 4 years, we take a great country and we bring it into the gutter. So that, politically speaking, is a crime against the stature and statesmanlike and civil discourse that we want in this country. But on the actual practical side, the Signalgate controversy shows what happens when you take responsible people and you put them in a clown-like environment. So Mike Waltz, good friend of mine. We served for years together on the Intelligence Committee. And Mike Waltz is a decorated former Green Beret. There are very few members of our military who are as exquisitely trained and as disciplined and as careful as Green Berets, because these guys get dropped behind enemy lines. They work with insurgents and learn their languages and stuff. These guys are the best of the best. In some ways, you know, everybody gets excited about the Navy SEALs. The Navy SEALs are pretty well trained too, but they're about breaking things and you know, whereas the Green Berets are about, you know, going behind enemy. These are the most disciplined and carefully trained people on the planet, and Mike Waltz set up a signal chat and included a reporter. And it's not that Mike Waltz is a bad guy. It's that when he's in an environment that is lax and doesn't care about accountability, even Mike Waltz does dumb things. And I try to make the case, Mike Waltz is now gone, that because life takes on a reality show quality. You know, just today, I have to not follow all this stuff, but just today, the president pardoned some reality show star that, you know, just did some terrible things. But anyway, life takes on a reality show quality. But I'm here to tell you that Pete Hegseth, heaven forbid, but there's a pretty good chance that the NGA is going to notice the North Koreans fueling a missile or the NRO's satellites are going to pick up a, convoy in the Sahel that we fear may be moving pandemic-related bioweapons, and the president is going to call Pete Hegseth up and say, Pete, what's going on here? And what should I do? And this stuff is going to be close to existential, right? I mean, that's the job. And I've got nothing personal against Pete Hegseth, but that's the job. And he is a million miles away from the person that when the missiles are being fueled or the Russians are activating their nuclear command and control satellites, or when China's, putting landing craft on a he's not the guy. Okay, I've now countered all that optimism before. But yes, as you can tell, on this national security stuff, this is where we just can't let the reality show ethic take over because the consequences are too severe.
I can go? Okay.
I'm going to leave it to you to hand the mic to whoever you want because
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here, Congressman. I know you have a lot of supporters here. However, I'm a MAGA Republican. So what Trump is doing is I voted for all of it. I voted for all of it. So I was told I can't debate you. I have to be respectful, which I'm going to be. So I'm not going to talk about the national side of things. We go back and forth all day on that. But again, what Trump is doing is what I voted for. But I do want to talk to you about Connecticut because, I'm a property owner now in Florida. I have to make a decision whether I stay a resident of this state or not. I think, Connecticut is becoming or is a supermajority one-party state. I think it's losing population, even though they tell you it's gaining in population, but that's just because they're counting the illegal immigrants. I don't see how you get business into this state given the electricity prices, given traffic on 95, and given taxes. So Connecticut's becoming a very tough state. I know we have a great environment here. We live in a bubble in Darien, and I love living in Darien. But you represent us in the Congress, this district in Connecticut. What are you doing to help Connecticut get out of, again, high electricity prices, traffic that is ridiculous, trying to get, you can't get business into this state, losing population. What are you able to do to help this state, which you represent?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And by the way, my favorite questions are questions from folks that disagree with me. And the first part of your thing, the MAGA thing, I've been doing this a little while, and I think it's fair to say, and my constituents would agree with me, that when the issue is tax policy or should we build nuclear power, should we, on the traditional issues, look, president won the election. I will respectfully and civilly and even joyously engage in debate on those issues, including, by the way, things like border policy and immigration and stuff. Where I hope it's not true that you voted for this is the unconstitutional stuff. So due process. I understand that Tren de Aragua guys are pretty bad guys, but let me just... So, all right. Let me just respond, because we shouldn't have a debate here. I'm happy to do that some other time, but no, there is not a different due process. There's sort of a due process. The point is, or the 14th Amendment. Like the 14th, I'm not a lawyer, but I can read the 14th Amendment and I can see that it says that if you're born in this country, you're a citizen, and you can't therefore do an executive officer. Anyway, on the unconstitutional stuff, that's where I really raise my voice. I take an oath to support and defend this Constitution. Look, I'm not a huge fan of the Second Amendment. I like to shoot, but I'm not a huge fan. But every 2 years, I raise my right hand and I pledge to support every single one of those amendments in the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment. So God bless you on your views on taxation or whatever it is. I represent a lot of right-wing people here. No problem with that. But on the unconstitutional stuff, our republic is too valuable to say like, oh, well, Tren de Aragua is so awful that we should suspend our constitutional norms. So that's probably the only area in which you and I are going to have an ardent disagreement. But let me get to your second question, which is what am I doing? I sort of foreshadowed it a little bit. A lot of what you asked about And I'm a little isolated down here in southwestern Connecticut because the economy in Fairfield County is actually doing really well. We're bringing businesses in. Henkel's moving in. Pitney Bowes is expanding. You know, down in Stamford in particular, we're growing. That's not true statewide. So it's sort of a strange little corner that I represent. But the answer, to keep it short, is what I was talking earlier about the Abundance Caucus. Power is expensive in Connecticut, not because Democrats are idiots or Republicans are bad or whatever. It's expensive here because we are at the tail end of the natural gas pipelines that move in from Pennsylvania and from the southeast of the United States. And by the time it gets here, it's both fairly rare and expensive. And we haven't built new generation. So we need to build more generation. We need to build more power lines. We need to move more gas into the state of Connecticut. Now, I say that with conviction, but there's another room somewhere which is like, you're not building power lines in my backyard. It's a hard thing. I don't know how you'd feel about power lines in your backyard, but it's a hard thing. But it really is about building 21st century infrastructure. I don't know. I've had to deal with 95 since I've lived in Connecticut for decades. There's no super easy solutions to that, but there is a combination of solutions, better and more predictable service on Metro North, more parking at train stations. And you said, what are you doing about it? You heard me talk about abundance. I'm doing everything I can to try to accelerate and build out the infrastructure that over time will address those problems.
So, with all due respect to my pickle buddy, Frank, here, I think it was Tom Friedman who said, when you hire clowns, expect a circus. So, I guess, I'm not as optimistic as you about what's going to happen here. And I think, hopefully, the midterms are what we have to look to. So I'd like to understand what the Democratic Party is doing to ensure that we get a more balanced Congress for the midterms. And a corollary to that really is, who's the leader of the Democratic Party today? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Look, let me come back on this optimism thing. I don't want you to think that I'm, some naive person. I was the last guy, well, one or two of us, last guy out of the chamber on January 6, 2021. And one of my many, many quarrels with MAGA was that that event is to be rejected, full stop. No conditionality, no BS. An attempt to stop the constitutional transfer of power, violent attempt with 140 assaults on police officers, is to be rejected, full stop, unconditionally. I was there. So this optimism is a little bit earned. And my concern, not with the policy of MAGA, but with its willingness to embrace brutality, language, and otherwise, and to be unconstitutional is a real problem. So, to the hard question, who's the leader of the Democratic Party? Here's the situation, and you know this, and it's hiding the fact that we do not have a figurehead in the party right now. Chuck Schumer is an operational guy. He knows how to make deals. He knows how to get senators elected. He knows how to raise a hell of a lot of money. But he's no Barack Obama in terms of motivating. Hakeem Jeffries is a very young, capable guy with no experience of congressional leadership. And so we find ourselves in this moment of vacuum, which is pretty painful because whatever you think of the president, he's raising all kinds of hell. The guy's done more press availability in the first 120 days than Biden did in 4 years, right? So he's just there. And Chuck and Hakeem have not sort of established that sense of leadership. And by the way, they went in different directions on this budget bill that we voted on, whatever it was, 2 months ago, where Hakeem goes one way and Chuck goes the other. And that sent a message to Democratic supporters and frankly everybody else that, no one's in charge. So how does this get fixed? The truth is, it is very hard for any senator or any member of the House to become the leader of the party. Just very hard. I represent 750,000 people. 2 senators here represent 3.5 million people. Very hard to do. What will happen is 2 things. One, the president's numbers will continue to go down. Unless you believe the tariffs aren't inflationary, unless you believe that people aren't going to get tired of the president using the word scum on Memorial Day, his numbers are going to continue to go down. And as a result, it's a little bit of a balance. The Democrats' numbers will rise, and this isn't magical. This happens every 2 years. My class was wiped out in 2010. Obama presidency, first midterm, absolutely wiped out. Lost 65 seats. The Republicans in the House have a 3-4 seat majority. In all likelihood, they will lose that in 26. If they don't, the Democratic Party really has to do some serious. Just needs to disband, quite frankly, if it can't win under those circumstances. But then eventually an Andy Bashir or a, Josh Shapiro or somebody will emerge and fill that vacuum. But in the meantime, for Democrats, it's enormously awkward and hugely unsatisfying to activists. As I travel the district, my Democratic activists are enraged. You guys aren't doing anything. And I have to explain, and this is profoundly unsatisfying, that our numbers are terrible. And that particularly in the House, the minority has almost no tools. I can go on TV, talk about stuff, but anyway, in the meantime, it is excruciatingly painful. But the natural tectonics of this thing mean that in all probability, the Democrats retake the House in a year and a half, probably not the Senate, but that's just me forecasting. And, we'll see in the years that follow.
Yeah, go there.
My question simply is, will the concern that the big, beautiful bill, as Trump puts it, will result in lowering of our credit rating and a ballooning of the national debt?
Yeah. So that's a good policy question to the gentleman, the gentleman's point. It's a good policy question. It'll add $3 trillion in 10 years to the deficit. That's sort of the Penn-Wharton model of CBO, $1 billion. That is going to send tremors, already has sent tremors through the bond market, no question about it. It's funny, I was a banker guy, so I have maybe a little bit more sensitivity to this than some of my colleagues. I'm sensing with the downgrade that we suffered, 3 weeks ago, I'm sensing that the world is starting to say, oh, wait a minute, there is a number beyond which the United States should not borrow. And so anyway, that bill will borrow over time, over 10 years, will borrow $3 trillion. One way or another, and we're having a big political argument about this, but $700 billion or roughly $70 billion a year is being taken out of Medicaid. That's not going to happen without a cost. And a lot of nutritional programs, which aren't necessarily important to folks in Darien, or at least most folks in Darien, but a lot of nutritional programs that feed, a quarter of the city of Bridgeport are going to be dumped on the state. None of that stuff is, I think, politically good or as a policy matter good. If you talk to Americans, and you're obviously hearing this from one side, but if you talk to Americans, by and large, this isn't super comfortable to say if you represent Fairfield County, but by and large, Americans want wealthier people to pay more taxes so that middle class and below middle class folks can pay a little less. That's overwhelmingly popular in the American population. Overwhelmingly, the American population does worry about the deficit. Now, they're not excited about any of the things you need to do to cut the deficit, but they're worried about the deficit. And by and large, they support the programs that help the people at the very bottom, like, SNAP, food stamps, and that sort of thing. So I say all that just to say there's an interesting political thing happening here, which is that the bill that passed 215 to 214 in the House is now out there, and people are looking at it, and my colleagues that voted for it are getting an earful on it, and the senators are watching that. So we're going to see, last sentence, we're going to see a pretty substantial churn in the Senate around that. And where I fear we end up, because 12 years ago I voted for the Simpson-Bowles budget, right? Where I fear we end up is where Washington usually ends up, which is everybody is made happy by a combination of cutting people's taxes and spending more money. That's what since I've been there, that's what folks have done. And I do think that we may be at a moment where the capital markets finally say enough. And that's going to be a very strange moment for this country. We're going to unearth the old Simpson-Bowles budget, which is like the one honest budget I've seen in, a decade and a half, if the capital markets finally tell us, you guys got to sober up.
Congressman, I have a question about the judiciary. You mentioned the important role in the judiciary in protecting the Constitution and providing some version of guardrails for what's happening in the current time frame. I'm worried about a lot of the decisions that are made by federal court judges, federal court judges. individual judges. And from what I understand, there are a number of those individuals that are threatened. I have a good friend who's a federal judge in Alabama, and he is one of several judges in his region that have received threats by way of anonymous pizzas that show up on his doorstep. Because that's a message. We know where you live. So it's an issue, I think, in terms of the role of the judiciary and the ability of our government to provide suitable protection for people who are put in a difficult position and have to render a decision as an individual that affects what happens in terms of overall policy.
Yeah, I'd heard about that. I don't know that I have a ton to say on it, other than the obvious point that over time, this country has evolved in a very ugly direction. I've seen this in my own fairly limited career. Our dialogue has gotten really ugly. More Americans than ever before. It's not a majority, but it's like 40%. 40% of Americans believe that violence may be a legitimate tool of political action. You know, we see young people, small numbers, but young people cheering the cold-blooded murder of a health insurance executive, the attack of January 6th, the threats against federal judges, the murder of these two young people, Israeli embassy employees and stuff. We are sliding to a place that is a very ugly place. And look, yes, of course, we're going to provide the protection that these people need, but we've got an obligation. And, I love the fact that we do it here in Fairfield County, Connecticut. We have an obligation to say, yeah, we don't agree on stuff, but we're going to do it with civility, and we're always going to reject threats and violence.
Can I ask you a question about Ukraine? The president came into office saying that he could solve it all within 24 hours. The current indication are that he's sort of ready to wash his hands of it. What are your thoughts on possible solutions?
Yeah, so I think we're at a fork in the road here right now with respect to Ukraine. And let me tell you that the opportunity to win the war in Ukraine was probably a 3-month period after the Russians were bogged down after their initial invasion. And the Biden administration, the United States, and Europe was way too fiddly on their commitment to the weaponry that would have allowed the Ukrainians at that time to push the Russians back to the pre-invasion borders. That's really not an option anymore, just as a matter of math and throw weights. So I think we're at a fork in the road between the president, when he says we're going to walking away and saying we're not providing aid, in which case this will be a frozen and ugly conflict for many, many years. The Ukrainians will defend their territory. The Europeans will step up. But, over time, just the sheer mass and the brutality of the Russian military will capture territory. I don't happen to believe they'll ever take Kyiv. We've learned what Ukrainians are. They will go into caves with rifles. And I mean, so I don't necessarily worry that Putin's initial war aims will be achieved, but it'll be very ugly. Or we will continue to provide the aid in concert with the Europeans that over time, 1, 2, 3 years, will make Putin finally realize that he has jeopardized his own regime by continuing to throw lives and money into this conflict. Neither is a happy outcome. That second outcome, which I hope for simply because it's consistent with who we've always been, standing up for democracy, notwithstanding what I said about the dangers we make, the mistakes we make. But just as a purely practical matter, if Putin comes away from this thinking that was really hard and really ugly, but it was at the end of the day, it was a worthwhile adventure, stand by for Moldova or Estonia or Lithuania, where there are substantial Russian minorities. And he just, in my opinion, cannot come out of this exercise thinking that it was a good idea.
Jim, thank you very much. I mean, I realize we committed to getting you out of here by 11:30, and it's bordering on that now, but we really appreciate your coming, talking to us. The number of questions that are unanswered suggests that you ought to come back again soon. And I hope we can get you next year to bring us up to date on where things are. But thank you very much for representation.